"Tell me something," the old man said as he slid 6 crumpled $1 bills onto a polished silver tray, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz and low conversations around them. "Is this enough to buy your respect?" The question didn't just land on the table. It settled into the room like a weight no one could ignore, heavy, deliberate, almost theatrical, and for a moment even the clinking of crystal glasses seemed to hesitate, as if the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The restaurant, the Sterling Room, sat 30 floors above downtown Chicago, wrapped in glass and quiet power. A place where deals were whispered over aged bourbon and futures were decided between courses that cost more than most people made in a week. And tonight the lighting was dim but precise, casting a warm glow over tailored suits and carefully composed smiles. The kind of room where money didn't need to introduce itself because everyone already knew who mattered. At the center of it all sat Jonathan Whitmore, a man whose name carried more weight than the skyline outside, his silver hair combed back, his posture relaxed in the way only someone with nothing left to prove could manage, and across from him, his children leaned in, not toward him, but toward the invisible future they were already dividing in their heads. Claire with her perfectly measured tone and Brandon with a grin that came too easily, both dressed like they had inherited confidence along with their last name. They weren't here just for dinner. Not really. They were here because tonight was supposed to be about legacy, about numbers on paper that would outlive the man signing them, about who would take control when the voice sat. The head of the table finally went quiet, and somewhere just behind that conversation, unnoticed and uninvited into its gravity, stood Maya Brooks, her black apron pressed, her posture straight, her presence as quiet as the flicker of candlelight she moved between, carrying plates, refilling glasses, doing the work that made rooms like this function without ever being acknowledged. She had learned early that invisibility was part of the uniform, that in places like this people looked through you, not at you, unless they needed something. And even then the way they spoke was less about words and more about assumption. But Maya didn't rush, didn't fumble, didn't shrink. She moved with a steady rhythm, each step measured, each gesture precise, like someone who understood that dignity wasn't something given, it was something carried. Jonathan had been watching her long before the $6 touched the tray, watching the way she responded when Brandon waved his hand without making eye contact, watching the way she waited without interrupting when Claire continued her sentence as if Maya didn't exist, watching the small details most people in the room would never notice because they had never needed to. And when he finally spoke, when he finally pulled her into the center of a conversation she hadn't asked to be part of, it wasn't impulsive, it was intentional. A quiet test wrapped in a casual tone, a moment designed to reveal something no balance sheet ever could. Maya paused, not long, just enough to acknowledge the question, her eyes lowering briefly to the $6 resting against polished metal, then lifting again to meet his gaze without challenge and without fear. And in that silence the room leaned in, not because they cared about her answer, but because they cared about what it would say about the game they were all playing. The unspoken hierarchy that placed some voices above others and some people beneath notice entirely. And for the first time that night, Maya Brooks was no longer invisible. She was the center of a question that wasn't really about money at all. No one at the table expected her to answer right away, and that pause, that single measured breath, stretched just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Because in a room where decisions worth millions of dollars were made in seconds, silence from someone like her was not part of the script, but Maya did not rush to fill it. She let it exist, steady and unshaken, as if she understood something the rest of them did not. And Jonathan noticed that first. Not her words, not yet, but the way. She did not bend under the weight of the question. Claire shifted slightly in her chair, the faintest crease forming between her brows as she reached for her glass of sparkling water, more out of habit than thirst, while Brandon leaned back with a smirk that bordered on boredom, tapping his fingers lightly against the table as if this were nothing more than an interruption to a conversation that actually mattered. And across from them Alden Pierce, the attorney who had spent the better part of 2 decades translating Jonathan Whitmore's intentions into legal permanence, watched quietly, his pen resting against the leather folder that contained drafts of a will no one at the table had seen in full, a will that, by the end of the night, was supposed to decide everything. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched endlessly, headlights threading through streets like veins of light. But inside the room, the focus had narrowed to something far smaller. 6 $1 bills and the woman standing beside them, Maya, straightened the tray slightly, not as a gesture of submission but as a simple act of order, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, not raised to challenge nor lowered to appease. "Sir, I do not measure respect by the number on a tip," she said, and the words landed without flourish, without performance, just clear enough to be heard and firm enough to stay. And for a brief moment no one responded, not because they had not heard her, but because they had not expected something so simple to carry that kind of weight. Brandon let out a short laugh, the kind that tried to reclaim control of a moment slipping away. "That is a polite way of saying it is not enough," he said, glancing at his sister as if inviting agreement. And Claire gave a small nod, her expression composed but distant, as though the exchange was already beneath her attention. But Jonathan did not laugh. He did not look away. He stayed exactly where he was, studying Maya not as a server, not as background, but as if she were a line in a contract he had not anticipated, something that required careful reading. "Then what do you measure it by?" he asked, his tone quieter now, less performative, more curious, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed the room again. Because this was no longer a test delivered from above. It was a question waiting for an answer that mattered. Maya held his gaze for a second longer, not defiant, not intimidated, simply present. And in that second, something unfamiliar moved through the space between them, something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with recognition. And when she responded, it was not with a speech or a clever remark. It was with a truth shaped by years no one at that table had lived. "I measure it by how I am treated before the tip ever shows up," she said. And there it was, the shift no one could quite name, but everyone could feel, because the conversation had moved away from dollars and into something far less comfortable, something that did not sit neatly inside a ledger or a contract, something that could not be negotiated or inherited. The soft music resumed its place in the background, but it sounded different now, like it had been pushed a little further away. And even the lights, warm and controlled, seemed to reveal more than they concealed, as if the room itself had turned a fraction toward honesty. And Jonathan Whitmore, who had spent a lifetime controlling outcomes, realized in that moment that this was no longer about a test he had designed. It was about an answer he had not prepared for. The words did not echo, they settled, and in a room built on polished certainty that was far more unsettling than noise. Because what Maya had offered was not defiance. It was clarity, and clarity had a way of exposing things people preferred to keep blurred. And for the first time that evening, the conversation at the table lost its rhythm, not completely, but enough for someone like Jonathan Whitmore to notice the shift in tempo. The way his daughter's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, the way Brandon's smile lingered a fraction too long before fading into something less confident, and the way Alden Pierce adjusted his pen, as if instinctively preparing to record something that had not yet been said, but somehow already mattered. Jonathan leaned back just slightly, not retreating, but creating space, the kind of space a man creates when he is no longer certain he is asking the right questions. And as he watched Maya step back into her role, lifting another glass, adjusting another plate with the same quiet precision, he realized something that unsettled him more than her answer. She had not changed at all. Not before his question, not during it, and not after, while everyone else at the table had, even if only slightly. And that consistency, that quiet refusal to bend, carried a kind of strength he had spent years trying to define in numbers and never quite captured. He had built his life on measurable outcomes, profit margins, quarterly reports, valuations that could be tracked and compared and controlled. But what sat in front of him now did not belong to any system he trusted. It did not fluctuate. It did not negotiate. It simply existed, and that made it harder to dismiss. "Where are you from?" he asked suddenly, not as a challenge this time, but as a question that seemed to come from somewhere older than the conversation itself. And Maya paused again, this time only briefly. "South Side, sir," she said, her tone unchanged, and that answer, simple as it was, carried its own weight, not because of the geography, but because of everything it implied, the kind of upbringing that did not come with safety nets or introductions, the kind that required a person to learn early what could not be taken for granted. Brandon let out a quiet breath through his nose, not quite a scoff, but close enough to reveal the gap between his world and hers. That explains it, he muttered under his breath, and while he did not say more, he did not need to, because the assumption behind his words filled the silence for him. But Maya did not react, not outwardly. She did not correct him, did not challenge him. She simply continued her work, and in that choice there was something far more deliberate than ignoring him. There was control, the kind that does not seek permission. Jonathan heard it though, every word, every tone, every layer beneath the surface, and something in his expression shifted again, not visibly to anyone who did not know him, but enough for Alden to notice, enough to recognize the beginning of a reconsideration, the kind that did not happen often and never happened lightly, because Jonathan Whitmore did not change direction without reason, and when he did, it was never small. The table attempted to return to its original purpose, Claire bringing up asset allocations, Brandon referencing expansion plans, numbers and projections flowing again as if they could overwrite what had just occurred. But the rhythm never fully recovered, because beneath every word now was the awareness of something unresolved, something that had interrupted the certainty of inheritance with a question no one at the table had been prepared to answer, and Jonathan, who had spent a lifetime deciding what mattered, found himself listening differently, not just to his children, not just to his lawyer, but to the absence of something he had assumed would always be there, alignment. And in its place a new thought began to form, quiet at first, almost unwelcome, that perhaps the value of what he was about to leave behind could not be determined by who wanted it most, but by who understood it least. Jonathan Whitmore did not interrupt his children, but he stopped listening to them in the way that mattered, because the words coming out of their mouths, percentages, shares, projected growth, all sounded the same as they had for years, clean, polished, predictable, and suddenly predictable felt dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. And for a man who had built an empire by identifying what others overlooked, incompleteness was a signal he could not ignore. He reached for his glass, not to drink, but to give his hands something to do while his mind recalibrated, and his eyes drifted again, not to the skyline, not to the documents resting near Alden's elbow, but to Maya, who had already stepped away from the center of attention as if it had never belonged to her, moving to another table, answering another quiet request, existing in a rhythm untouched by the tension she had just shifted, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because influence usually left a trace, a reaction, a ripple of awareness, but she carried on as though nothing had changed, as though her value had never been tied to whether anyone in that room recognized it. "We should finalize tonight," Claire said, her tone controlled but edged with urgency. "There is no reason to delay decisions that are already clear," and Brandon nodded quickly, leaning forward with renewed confidence, as if momentum alone could restore the direction they had assumed was theirs. "The market will respond better if leadership transition is clean and immediate," he added, speaking not to his father as much as past him, as though the outcome had already been secured, and Jonathan listened, but only partially, because something in their certainty now felt rehearsed, not earned. Alden cleared his throat gently, a subtle reminder of presence rather than interruption. "Mr. Whitmore, I have the current draft ready if you would like to review before execution," he said, his voice measured, neutral, the voice of a man who understood that timing mattered more than words. In moments like this, and Jonathan turned slightly, his gaze settling on the leather folder that held decades of work distilled into clauses and signatures, a document designed to outlive him, to define him after he was gone. And for the first time, he did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he asked a question that did not belong in a boardroom or a legal consultation. "Alden, how many times have we revised this?" And the lawyer paused, calculating not numbers, but implications. "7 major revisions over the past 3 years," he replied, and Jonathan nodded slowly, as if confirming something only he could see. 7 attempts to capture intent, to translate a life into distribution, and yet here they were, still discussing, still assuming, still missing something. Across the room Maya returned, not to their table at first, but to another guest, placing a dish with the same care, the same quiet professionalism. And when she finally approached again, it was not with hesitation, but with purpose. "Can I bring you anything else this evening?" she asked, her tone unchanged, her presence steady, and for a brief moment the contrast between her simplicity and the complexity at the table became impossible to ignore, because she was asking a question rooted in service, while everyone else had been speaking in terms of control. Brandon waved a hand dismissively, not even looking at her this time. "No, we are fine," he said, already turning back to the conversation as though she had already disappeared. But Jonathan did not let the moment pass. "Actually, stay a moment," he said, and the words shifted the table again, not dramatically, but enough to create another pause, another break in expectation, and Maya stopped, not surprised, not resistant, just present, waiting, and Jonathan studied her again, not as a curiosity, not as a challenge, but as a reference point, something real against which everything else in the room could be measured. "You said you measure respect by how you are treated before the tip," he began, his voice quieter now, less about testing and more about understanding. "Tell me, what would have made this a respectful table for you?" And the question hung there, more vulnerable than the first, because this time it was not about what she would accept, it was about what they had failed to offer, and in that shift, the balance of the room tilted once more, not toward money, not toward power, but toward something far more difficult to quantify, the truth they had all been avoiding without even realizing it. The question did not demand an answer, it invited one, and that difference changed everything, because for the first time that evening the balance of the room was not tilted by wealth or position, but by honesty, and honesty had a way of making even the most confident people uncomfortable. Maya did not speak immediately, not because she did not know what to say, but because she understood the weight behind what had been asked, and in a place where every word could shift perception, she chose hers. Carefully, not to impress, not to defend, but to tell the truth without dressing it up. "It would have been simple," she said at last, her voice steady, her posture unchanged. "You would have looked at me when you spoke, used my name if you knew it, and treated me like I was part of the room before deciding what I was worth after. And there it was again, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, the kind of answer that did not attack yet still exposed. And for a brief moment the silence that followed was not awkward, it was reflective. Claire's expression tightened, not outwardly enough to draw attention, but enough to reveal that the words had landed somewhere she did not intend to acknowledge, and Brandon shifted in his seat. His earlier confidence now edged with something less certain, something closer to irritation than amusement, because this was not the direction he expected the evening to take, and more importantly, it was not a direction he could easily control. Jonathan did not respond right away. He let the words settle, turning them over in his mind the same way he had once evaluated risks and opportunities, except this time there was no data to rely on, no projection to validate the outcome, just a simple measure he had overlooked for far too long. And as he sat there, surrounded by the very people he had built his life to provide for, he realized that provision and understanding were not the same thing, and that realization carried a quiet weight. "What is your name?" he asked, the question soft but deliberate, and Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "Maya, sir," she replied, and something about hearing it, about placing a name where there had only been a role before, shifted the dynamic again, not dramatically, but enough to make the moment real in a way it had not been just minutes earlier. Jonathan nodded once, almost to himself. "Thank you, Maya," he said, and it was a simple sentence, one that should have been said long before any of this began, but in that room, in that moment, it carried more meaning than the contracts resting at the edge of the table, because it marked a change not in status, but in awareness. Alden watched closely, not because of Maya, but because of Jonathan, because he recognized the pattern of thought that preceded decisions no one expected, the kind that did not follow negotiation but conviction, and he had seen it before, in boardrooms, in acquisitions, in moments when Jonathan chose a path others had dismissed, and each time it had rewritten outcomes entirely. Brandon leaned forward again, trying to redirect the conversation back to familiar ground. "Are we really pausing everything for this?" he said, his tone sharper now, less controlled. "We have real decisions to make tonight." And Claire added quietly, This is not relevant to the discussion. But even as they spoke, the certainty behind their words had begun to crack. Because somewhere beneath their insistence they understood that something had already shifted, something they could not fully see yet could no longer ignore. Jonathan turned his attention back to them slowly, not with frustration, not with anger, but with a calm that felt heavier than either. "It is relevant," he said, his voice even, "more than you realize," and he let that sit for a moment before continuing. "Because everything we are about to decide is based on what we believe matters. And tonight, I am starting to question whether we have been measuring that correctly." And the words did not raise. His voice did not demand agreement, but they carried a finality that neither Claire nor Brandon could easily dismiss. And as Maya stepped back once more, returning to her work without waiting for acknowledgement, the room remained altered, not by her presence alone, but by the truth she had spoken, a truth that now sat at the table alongside inheritance, ownership, and legacy, refusing to be ignored. Jonathan Whitmore did not move right away, and that stillness carried more weight than any immediate decision could have, because for a man like him hesitation was never about uncertainty. It was about recalibration, about recognizing that the equation he had trusted for decades no longer balanced the way it used to. And as he looked at his children across the table, at the confidence they wore like something inherited rather than earned, he felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not anger, not disappointment, but clarity, the kind that arrives quietly and refuses to leave. He reached forward at last, not for his glass, not for the $6 that still rested untouched on the tray, but for the leather folder in front of Alden, and when his fingers rested on it, the room seemed to tighten. Again, because this was the moment everything had been building toward, just not in the way anyone expected. "Open it," Jonathan said, his voice calm, and Alden hesitated for the briefest second, not because he doubted the instruction, but because he understood the implication behind it. This was no longer a routine review. This was a shift, and when he opened the folder, the sound of paper against leather felt louder than it should have, as though even the smallest movement had gained significance. Claire leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. "We already discussed the structure," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "There is no need to revisit settled decisions." And Brandon nodded in agreement, more openly this time. "Everything is aligned, Dad. We have been through this." But Jonathan did not look at them. Not yet. His focus remained on the document, on the lines that translated his life into percentages and control. And for a moment he said nothing, letting the silence stretch just enough to remind everyone that this was his decision, not theirs. "Alden," he said finally, "if I wanted to change this tonight, how long would it take?" And the question landed harder than any declaration could have, because it did not suggest doubt. It confirmed it, and Alden closed the folder slowly, considering his response not as a lawyer, but as someone who understood timing. "We can draft revisions immediately," he said, "but final execution would require witnesses and formal filing in the morning." And Jonathan nodded once, as if that answer had been expected, as if he had already moved past the idea of whether to change it, and was now considering how. Brandon's composure cracked just enough to show urgency. "Change it to what?" he asked, his voice no longer casual, no longer amused, and Claire followed, quieter but sharper. "You cannot make decisions like this based on a conversation with a server." And the word server hung there, stripped of a name, stripped of the identity that had just been acknowledged, and Jonathan finally looked up, not at Maya, who had already stepped away again, but at his children, and there was something in his expression that neither of them had seen before. Not weakness, not hesitation, but distance, the kind that comes when someone begins to see things from a different place. "That is exactly the point," he said, his voice even. "I have spent years making decisions based on conversations with people who already agree with me." And he paused, letting that settle before continuing. "Tonight, I heard something different, something honest, and it made me realize I have been asking the wrong questions." And as he spoke, his hand rested on the folder, not gripping it, not protecting it, just acknowledging it as something that could change, something that was no longer fixed simply because it had been written. Across the room, Maya moved quietly between tables, unaware or perhaps uninterested in the shift unfolding behind her, and that distance, That separation between her world and theirs only made the contrast clearer, because while they debated ownership, she continued with purpose, steady and unaffected, and Jonathan watched her for a moment longer before returning his attention to the table. "Before we decide who gets what," he said, "I need to understand who knows why any of it matters." And the question was not rhetorical, it was not philosophical, it was immediate, and it hung in the air like a line that would determine everything that followed, because this was no longer about dividing wealth. It was about redefining it, and for the first time that night, no one at the table had an answer ready. The question did not disappear when it was asked. It stayed, pressing against the silence like something that demanded to be acknowledged. And for the first time that evening, neither Claire nor Brandon rushed to fill it, because the kind of answer Jonathan was asking for could not be assembled from confidence alone. It required something deeper, something neither of them had prepared for. Brandon leaned forward eventually, his voice measured but edged with frustration. "It matters because it is what you built," he said, choosing a direction he believed was safe. "It represents everything you worked for, everything you sacrificed, and it should stay in the family." And he paused, as if expecting that to be enough, as if legacy could be secured by proximity alone. But Jonathan did not nod, did not affirm. He simply listened, and in that listening there was a quiet evaluation taking place, not of the words themselves, but of what they revealed. Claire followed, more composed, more precise. "It matters because it ensures continuity," she added, her tone steady. "Your name, your company, your influence, all of it remains intact through us, through people who understand how to manage it." And her argument was clean, structured, the kind that would hold up in a boardroom. But again, Jonathan did not respond immediately, and the absence of approval felt louder than disagreement would have, because approval was what they expected, what they had built their confidence around. Alden remained still, observing, recognizing the familiar pattern of a decision forming beneath the surface, one that would not be swayed by repetition or certainty, because Jonathan Whitmore had never been a man who followed expectation when something more meaningful revealed itself. Across the room, Maya placed a check at another table, her movements unhurried, her expression neutral, and as she turned, her eyes briefly met Jonathan's again, not intentionally, not as part of the conversation, but simply as a moment of awareness. And in that brief exchange there was no demand, no anticipation, just presence. And somehow that presence carried more weight than everything that had been said at the table for the past hour. Jonathan exhaled slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of recognition, because the answers he had just heard, though polished, though logical, were built on assumption, on the idea that inheritance was a right rather than a responsibility, and that assumption no longer sat comfortably with him. "You both speak about control," he said at last, his voice calm but deliberate. "About preserving what exists, about maintaining structure, but neither of you has told me why any of it should exist beyond the fact that it already does." And the words were not harsh, but they were direct, and they cut through the conversation with a clarity that could not be easily dismissed. Brandon's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible sign of pressure. "Because it is ours," he replied, more quickly this time, less measured. And in that answer, simple as it was, something became unmistakably clear, because ownership without understanding had always been the easiest position to defend, and the weakest. Claire did not speak immediately, her mind working through a response that would restore balance. But the pause itself spoke volumes, because for someone like her, silence was rare, and when it came, it meant something had not aligned the way she expected. Jonathan nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what had just been revealed. And then his gaze shifted again, not to challenge, not to confront, but to reconsider, because the question he had asked was no longer directed at them alone. It had expanded, it had become something larger, something that reached beyond the table and into the very idea of what legacy meant. "Alden," he said, quietly, "in all the years we have worked together, how many people have we asked that question?" And the lawyer paused, searching not for a precise number, but for truth. "Not many," he admitted. "It is not a question most people think to ask." And Jonathan allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something he had just realized. that the absence of that question had shaped every decision he had made, every assumption he had carried, and now, in a room filled with everything he had built, it was the one question that mattered most. The city outside continued its steady motion, unaware of the shift taking place high above it. And inside the Sterling room the air had changed, not dramatically, but undeniably, because the conversation was no longer about dividing wealth. It was about defining its purpose. And in that shift the certainty that had once filled the table began to dissolve, leaving behind something far more difficult to navigate, the truth that not everything valuable could be passed down simply by writing it into a document. Jonathan did not look at the skyline this time. He looked at the document, at the pages that had once represented certainty. And for a long moment, he simply rested his hand on them as if feeling their weight rather than reading their contents. Because what he was about to change was not just numbers or names, it was the meaning behind them. And meaning was far harder to rewrite than ink. "Alden," he said quietly, "take this down." And the lawyer straightened almost instantly. Pen ready, posture shifting from observer to instrument. Because he recognized that tone, it was the tone Jonathan used when a decision had already been made and all that remained was to give it form. Claire's voice came in quickly, controlled but unmistakably tense. "You are not seriously revising everything based on this." And Brandon followed, less restrained. "This is not rational. Dad, you cannot restructure an entire estate because of a conversation." But Jonathan did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself in the way they expected. He simply began. "The current allocation is void." And the words landed with quiet finality, not dramatic, not explosive, but absolute. And Alden did not question it. He wrote, because his role was not to interpret intent, it was to capture it. The air at the table shifted again, sharper now, more defined, because uncertainty had given way to action, and action had consequences. "A new trust will be established," Jonathan continued, his voice steady, each word placed with the same precision he had used in every major decision of his career. "The Eleanor Whitmore Dignity Fund." And for the first time that evening a name entered the room that had not been part of any prior discussion, a name that carried history, memory, something deeper than strategy. And Alden paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing to write, because he understood that this was not a symbolic addition. This was a foundation. Claire leaned back slightly, her composure holding but her control slipping. "You are diverting assets into a charity," she said, more statement than question. And Jonathan nodded once. "A fund," he corrected gently, "dedicated to supporting workers in service industries, single-parent households, and education grants for those who do not have access to opportunity." And the specificity of it, the clarity, made it impossible to dismiss as impulsive, because this was not reaction. This was intention taking shape. Brandon shook his head, disbelief replacing irritation. "And who exactly is going to run this?" he asked. The question edged with something closer to challenge now. And Jonathan's gaze shifted, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the answer already forming. "It will be managed by a board," he said. "But I will appoint a community advisor." And there was a brief pause, not hesitation, but recognition of what that next word would represent. "Maya Brooks," he said. And the name, spoken clearly, deliberately, carried through the room with a weight no one could ignore. Claire's expression changed then, not anger, not outrage, but something colder, something more precise. "You are assigning influence over a significant portion of your estate to someone you met tonight," she said, and Jonathan met her gaze without defensiveness, without apology. "I am assigning influence to someone who understands the value of what I failed to measure," he replied, and the simplicity of it left little room for argument. Across the room Maya had just finished clearing another table when a manager approached her quietly, gesturing toward Jonathan's table with a look that mixed confusion and urgency. And for a moment she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of unfamiliarity, because being called back into that space, into that conversation, was not part of her routine. But she walked over anyway, steady as before, unaware of the full weight of what had just been set in motion. Jonathan turned toward her as she approached, not as a customer calling a server, but as a man acknowledging another person's presence. "Maya," he said, and the way he said her name, without title, without distance, changed the tone of the moment entirely. I am going to ask you something unusual. And the room seemed to hold its breath again, because this was no longer about a test, no longer about a conversation. This was about a decision that had already begun to rewrite everything. And for the first time that night, the future being discussed at that table was no longer limited to the people who had assumed it belonged to them. The room did not feel the same when Maya stepped closer this time, because something invisible had shifted, not in the lighting or the music, but in the way attention moved, the way silence held, the way even the smallest gestures carried weight. And for a woman who had spent years being overlooked, the difference was immediate, even if no one explained it. She stopped beside the table, her posture unchanged, her hands steady, her expression composed, and yet the air around her felt different, as if the room itself had decided to recognize her presence. Jonathan Whitmore looked at her not as a customer evaluating service, but as a man standing at the edge of a decision he could not undo. And for a moment he did not speak, because some questions required more than words to be asked properly. They required intention. "Maya," he said at last, his voice calm, grounded. "Everything we have discussed tonight has been about what I leave behind." And he paused, not for effect, but because he wanted the meaning to settle. "But I realized something important. What I leave behind only matters if it serves a purpose beyond the people who receive it." And the words did not sound rehearsed. They sounded discovered, as if they had only fully formed in the moment he spoke them. Maya listened, not interrupting, not assuming, simply present, and that presence gave the moment space to unfold without pressure. Jonathan continued, "I have spent years building something that I believed was valuable. But tonight you reminded me that value is not measured by how much something is worth. It is measured by who it reaches and how it changes them." And as he spoke, there was no defensiveness, no attempt to justify what he had done before, only an acknowledgement of what he had missed. Claire remained still, her silence now more controlled than before, while Brandon looked between them, searching for something to hold on to, something that would return the conversation to familiar ground. But nothing came, because the ground itself had changed. Jonathan took a slow breath, then asked the question that would define everything that followed. "Would you be willing to help ensure that what I leave behind actually serves people who need it?" And the simplicity of it made it more powerful, because it was not framed as an offer, not presented as a reward. It was a request, one grounded in respect rather than authority. Maya did not answer immediately, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she understood the gravity behind the words. And when she spoke, her voice remained steady, unchanged from the moment. She had first been asked about $6. "I do not know anything about managing something like that," she said honestly. "But I do know what it feels like to need help and not have it." And that honesty, unpolished and direct, carried more weight than any prepared response could have, because it aligned perfectly with the purpose Jonathan had just defined. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition. "That is exactly why I am asking," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice now, no uncertainty, only clarity. Alden closed the folder slowly, the sound quiet but final, because what had just been decided would not fit back into the document that had been prepared. It would require something new, something built on a different understanding. Claire finally spoke again, her voice controlled but firm. "You are changing everything." And Jonathan looked at her, not with conflict, but with calm acceptance. "No," he said softly, "I am correcting it." And in that correction there was no anger, only purpose. Brandon leaned back, the fight leaving him not because he agreed, but because he realized the decision had already been made. And in that realization the power he assumed he held slipped quietly away. Maya stood there for a moment longer, not as a symbol, not as a disruption, but as a person who had been seen. And then she nodded once, a small gesture, not dramatic, not overstated, just enough to acknowledge what had been asked of her. Jonathan reached for the $6 still resting on the tray and placed them gently back into her hand, not as a tip, but as a reminder. And his voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of everything that had changed. "Money can be written into a will," he said, "but meaning has to be chosen." And as Maya stepped away, returning to her work with the same quiet dignity she had always carried, the room remained altered, not because of what had been taken, but because of what had finally been understood, and for the first time that night, what Jonathan Whitmore was leaving behind felt less like an inheritance and more like a legacy worth carrying.